Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here in the province of Chaco. I would like to thank Pastor Jorge Ledesma for the invitation.
Quiero agradecer al pastor Jorge Ledesma por la invitación
and congratulate him for this beautiful auditorium, the biggest one in which faith has been dedicated throughout the country. No more, no less than that. I usually say that there are three battlefronts to change the country. The front of management. From the presidency, we carry out the reforms that Argentina demands urgently. The political front, where we build the necessary institutional power to make those reforms possible. And the front of the cultural battle, where we fight to promote the ideas of freedom and defeat the ideas of socialism. This has been inculcated in a good part of society over the last decades. The cultural battle is perhaps the most difficult of all fronts in which we fight, because it is an invisible terrain and where ideas of different types and origins have colonized the minds of people for a long time, many times without this being noticed. Historically, there was in the Western world a spontaneous alignment between the ideas of freedom and our culture. And the economic and social development of our societies at the hands of free company capitalism. But in the last decades, the left has promoted in a sustained and effective way its cultural battle, and unfortunately it won. It became a culture of moral relativism over those values and principles that have ordered our societies for centuries. It renounced the culture of work, it renounced saving, it renounced the sacred value of our own word and even the supreme value of good. And these values were replaced by chimeras. The love of work was opposed to the fetishization of leisure. Saving was changed by uncontrolled spending and irresponsible indebtedness. But this is not free, because these are the elemental concepts that allowed our ancestors to harvest what they sowed and leave a legacy. Massively adopting the contrary ideas has led directly to reap the resources that others generated, kicking forward the damage that it would generate. In other words, the West, for decades, has been rummaging through the branches over which it is sitting, believing that as it is not yet broken, it will never break. The interesting thing here, and that has to do with what brings us together today, the West, as we know it, is largely the result of their application of the law. The work has a vocation, the individual responsibility, the provision, and the respect for the law. Es en gran medida el resultado de la aplicación sostenida de ciertos valores de la raíz judeo-cristiana, el trabajo como vocación. As Gabriel Mendoza says, the West is the result of the application of certain values of the Jewish-Christian root. As Gabriel Vallerini says, the first lessons of ecumenism already appear in Genesis. God gives Abraham, when he settles in Canaan, two orders: multiply and cultivate the earth. Far from being a moral obstacle, wealth can then be seen as a blessing for those who are faithful to the commandment. And not to mention the defense of life. The Creator is a rich and merciful God who supplies the needs of His faithful. However, when the people or nation moves away from its law, that is, from the moral ethical principles revealed, then it quickly finds itself with poverty, illness, crime and misery. Now, it is not about affirming that capitalism was born in the Old or the New Testament.
la miseria.
but rather remembering that the ethics of capitalism were born in the Old and the New Testament. It is about remembering that the ethics of modern capitalism found in the Jewish-Christian tradition a fertile ground to develop. As one of the fathers of sociology, Max Weber explained, discipline, frugality, hard work, saving, and the sense of vocation. That specifically promotes Protestantism, functioned as the cultural matrix in which the spirit of capitalism could emerge. Therefore, it is not unreasonable to say that the practical application of these values constituted an ethical basis that facilitated the development of capitalism. That is, an economic system oriented towards free social cooperation and productive accumulation. That, on the ground of scriptures, catapulted to the West to the greatest boom of prosperity ever witnessed by man. Thousands of millions of people were rescued from poverty, literacy was practically eradicated, and life expectancy improved exponentially. This caused the number of living people to multiply several times, all thanks to the application of conduct rules that were established thousands of years ago, but which have eternal efficiency and which capitalism accentuated. Nevertheless, the left, due to its anti-capitalist nature, has distorted the Jewish-Christian values and principles that made the West great. In its twisted morality, which is a distortion of the morality on which civilization was built, it has reversed the order of the factors that lead to capitalism. There is a passage in Genesis chapter 26 which says, Isaac sown that land and God blessed him, and that year he sown it 100 times. And he became rich and prospered. He became so great that he came to have much power. He had herds of sheep and sheep of sheep. And he had a lot of land, and he had a lot of land. And he had a lot of land, and he had a lot of land. And he had a lot of land. And the following year he had herds of land and sheep of sheep. And a lot of herds of sheep. But the Philistines envied it. At that moment in the sacred scriptures, the envious ones proceed to destroy the work of Abraham and Isaac. Very relevant quotes from some notable economists like Thomas Sowell and Jesus Huerta de Soto. One of the wonderful things that Thomas Sowell points out is talking about social justice, because this is important. That is one of the viruses that have infected in their heads, and that fills everyone with envy, hatred, and resentment. And what is social justice all about? In the end, social justice is nothing more or less than the rhetoric of envy. It is envy disguised as profound thinking. But it is still a capital sin, as Thomas Sowell would say at some point. Since when has envy ceased to be a capital sin to become a virtue? They are not going to force us. We know the sacred scriptures. Thank you. In fact, probably, and following the line of Jesus Huerta de Soto, there should be nothing more anti-Christian, anti-Jewish than the idea of social justice. Because social justice is basically stealing from a person the fruits of his work and giving it to another. It is charity imposed by force, and charity cannot be at the tip of a gun. Charity has to emerge from the heart, from the soul, from the spirit of one, and not with a gun in the head. Social justice is frankly against the 7th and the 10th commandments. Because stealing is wrong and coveting other people's goods as well. In short, envy is a sin that destroys the fruit of the effort of your neighbor. And as it happens, just as hard work is at the core of capitalist ethics, envy is the sin that is at the heart of a nefarious ideology. And it is a sin that is at the core of capitalist ideology. Envy is the sin that is at the heart of the nefarious socialist ideology. Because, in the end, socialism has to do with that, with envy and resentment. Resentment is the envious one who does not have the means to steal from the other what he has. And that is why a false god is created, which is the state, which the envious and resentful worship, to steal from people the fruit of their work. In short, the envious one believes that the key to the economy is to redistribute what others produce. However, the logical and moral order indicates that first comes merit and work, and then material wealth. In other words, the key is not in the distribution of wealth, but in the promotion of virtue, since the generation of it is a consequence of the second. For the left, on the other hand, destiny in the circumstances in which one is born determine all his life and his actions. That is why, in the end, for them, freedom does not really exist. But it is a mere illusion, which ultimately implies that each person does not own his own actions. In this way, the left justifies criminal or antisocial behavior. This crime is, for this, an act that can be justified, produced by an unjust system. It is not necessary to elaborate on the risk that such a worldview implies, which cannot be determined in any other way than the absolute dissolution of the social fabric. But look at how it has been for years promoting the Zaffarani doctrine, where the victim was put in the place of the criminal and vice versa. But as we have said since during the campaign and in the government, here the one who does them pays them. Because in the end, the left, instead of convincing people, the left has throughout history imposed by force what man should be. They do not see reality for what it is, but for what they would like it to be. They use it in their favor to build a story in which, through the power of the state, they have the power to double the reality itself. This is what they understand and defend as social justice, a system that treats its citizens in an unequal way before the law, in which they are judges and interested parties at the same time. In this way, they even steal from those who have little to distribute in a way that is not enough. Social justice not only is a violation of property rights, going against equality before the law, but also violates the first fundamental principle of the economy, which is the principle of scarcity. Here there was an interesting phrase also by Thomas Sowell. He says that the first law of the economics is the law of scarcity. We are not in paradise, we are looking for it. And what is the first law of politics? To violate, ignore, and hinder the first law of the economics. But beyond this humor, the first law of the economics is a law of scarcity. But beyond this humor, which has a lot to do with reality, let's think that if each need corresponds to a right, and the needs are potentially infinite, then there are not enough resources in the world to satisfy the needs of all. During the last decades, the left created a unique language about justice, understood exclusively in distributive terms. But this is not the true meaning of justice, because it is intrinsically unfair, because to give to some you have to take away from others, and because as an Argentina we have learned by the bad, the one he distributes is left with the best part, but luckily they are shouting to fall prisoners. The true meaning of justice is that what one gets in life will be a function of merit, and the tenacity that one employs in pursuing one's goals. Justice is a matter of retribution. That is to say, that each one receives what corresponds to him. Those who receive justice, they receive what corresponds to them. They tend to repeat that no one is saved alone, and they accuse us of being individualists. But the reality is that capitalism promotes the only genuine communities where individuals voluntarily associate. In them one must satisfy the other with goods and services that the other wants, can or cannot teach or improve their own lives. That is the true organized community, not the leftist aberration of forced collectivization. In fact, the capitalist system is not only the only god that generates efficiency, but also promotes peace. There's a very prominent phrase by Pasha that said, "We trade enters, bullets do not enter." And also, trade makes us generate interdependence and forces us to live in peace. And that is wonderful. But obviously, what does the left do? It perverts everything. All these inverted values of the left or anti-values represent the opposite of what made us great as a civilization. And if the Judeo-Christian values have been an inexhaustible source of progress, the anti-values of the left end are at the opposite end: poverty, misery, and underdevelopment. And I must also tell you that the first thing they attack when they begin to advance is about the faith of the individuals. They want to replace our God of the heavens with their cursed God state. And this it has happened once and several times, and every time where socialism was applied. If they succeed, we pass from a world of abundance to a world of scarcity. This is proven in all the places where their ideas came to be, starting with our country, and we will continue to do so. This was proven in all the places where their ideas came to be, starting with our country. In a few words, if the Judeo-Christian tradition brought us civilization, the left leads us indefinitely to barbarism. All these nefarious ideas are transmitted and propagated by parasites, infecting the minds of millions of human beings. Thanks to decades of propaganda effort by politicians, businessmen, unions, and other members of the caste, this pernicious set of ideas, anti-liberty, has been propagated to the core of society. This is how it reached the point of confusing and becoming inseparable from many people of the common ideal. And there are many people who, today, if false conceptual constructions, they think that the poverty is the fault of the wealth of others. They think that any form of credit is financial grifting. They think that businessmen are enemies of workers instead of natural partners. And they think that paying a cell phone in Argentina is twice as expensive than what it is, for example, in Chile, to live with what is ours. A good part of society has been infected by these ideas, and today thinks and acts according to them. These people have become carnivores of the political caste that infected them. They are like prisoners who seek to make amends with their captor, going against those who are of the same condition. They are those who are accustomed to captivity. They who do not tolerate their own freedom or the freedom of others. Most of them are not intrinsically bad, and within them they still possess the germ of freedom. But they have heard and repeated the son of the sirens for too long, and today they are asleep. That is why the word of the Creator is so important. Because it makes them embrace the base of the Judeo-Christian culture, and it makes them come out of this perpetuity that has sunk us into misery. The ideology of the omnipresent state proposes the state as a kind of God that can bring paradise to earthly life if we gave it power. The rationale is that if they only deposit their faith in the state, if only the economic powers are allowed to be led by the politicians on duty, then we will all be happy. But the true result of empowering the state ultimately is that the bond between work and reward breaks, between virtue and happiness. And the reality is that this is already in the Bible. It is in the Old Testament and it is also in the New Testament. There is a master's lecture by Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto called God, Anarchy and Pope Francis, and there he mentions two episodes where it is clearly evident that the state is the representation of the evil in the earth. In the first case, it is that of Samuel chapter 8, where, given that Samuel was already old and his children did not want to continue his way, they go and ask him to have a king. Then, when Samuel speaks to the Creator, he says, "Do you want a king?" And the Lord says that they want a king because they did not trust him. And he says, "But go and tell them how all the things that will be taken away from you having that king. And that, in the end, not only will it impoverish them, because it will take away the best of each one, but they will also end up losing their freedom." In addition, this idea of the state is a representation of evil. Where it is more explicitly clear is in the Gospel of St. Luke. I am going to read the quote from chapter 4, verse 5. When the Lord Jesus Christ is in front of the three temptations that the evil proposes to him, and in the worst of all, the evil proposes that he kneels before him, because he shows him all the kingdoms of the world, that is, the state. And he says that if he kneels before him, he will give him power over all the states of the world, because that power was given to him. That is, there is the unconfession of the evil, that the state is the representation of the devil. That is why every time the state advances, there is more poverty, there are more calamities, there is misery. That is why I tell you, let's awaken to faith, let's awaken to faith, because that is what will bring us not only heaven, but prosperity here on earth as well. It is more because, in the clientelism, God, who abhors so much, to distribute benefits without the measure of any merit beyond the political convenience of those he distributes. This is very important to be clear. One of the things that deeply guides us in our design of policies is moral conviction.
en nuestro diseño de políticas es una convicción moral.
A moral ethical conviction and moral ethical convictions are the values of the West.
Son los valores de
And the values of the West is the Judeo-Christian culture.
Judeo-Cristiana.
That is why, for us, every time we face a situation that needs to be resolved,
Nos enfrentamos a una situación que hay que
we
resolver.
repeatedly repeat that wonderful definition of liberalism that Professor Abarta Venicus Iger proposed,
Del liberalismo que ha propuesto el profesor Alberto Venegas Lynch, hijo,
inspired by John Locke, and says that liberalism is the respect and restriction of the next person's life project,
el liberalismo es el respeto irrestricto del proyecto de vida del prójimo,
based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of life, freedom and
y
property,
en defensa de la vida, la libertad y la propiedad.
In short, you will not kill because you will respect life.
No matarás, porque respetarás la vida.
You will not coerce foreign goods, and therefore you will not steal because you will respect property rights. And also, if the Lord made us free, why would a bureaucrat make us slaves?
Un burócrata nos va a hacer esclavos.
Long lies.
Viva.
At the same time, these left-wing men wanted to be the spokespersons of the workers,
Hombres de izquierda. Quisieron ser los portavoces de los
while
trabajadores
rejecting the ethics of work that we have today claimed throughout the speech.
que hoy hemos reivindicado a lo largo del discurso. Y la
And the
casta
caste set up a political, economic and social system that dispossessed the true workers
a los verdaderos trabajadores.
to benefit their servants and adulators, businessmen, corrupt politicians and the left-wing journalists.
Empresarios prebendarios, los políticos corruptos y los periodistas ensobrados.
In short, this false god they created existed not more nor less than to punish the just and reward the sinful.
Menos que para castigar a los justos y premiar a los pecaminosos.
The cultists of the state built for this a radical commission that insisted on denying accountable identities,
Una radical que insistía en negar identidades contables,
such as that the emission generates inflation. All this to hide the aggravation of the gold mine,
agigantamiento del becerro de oro.
because in the end they are nothing more than that. It is a gold mine. The state is the gold mine. People found that each time their work yielded less,
Trabajo rendía menos,
it was devoured by excessive taxes, starting with the smuggling,
empezando por el señoreaje,
the most coward of taxes because it required a monetary illusion for its execution.
para su ejecución,
Society fell into poverty and fiscal slavery.
y el esclavismo fiscal.
They destroyed the dignity of what because any independence offended its false god.
Ofendía a su falso Dios.
Many out of fear or benefit became sycophants of the caste,
Se convirtieron en carneros de la casta.
justifying and promoting this model. However, a great majority decided that it was worth fighting to not live kneeling.
Luchar para no vivir arrodillados.
We have just seen and witnessed Luke 4, verse 5,
Ser testigo de Lucas 4, versículo 5.
because the Son of God did not kneel before the
Se
wicked.
arrodilló frente al maligno.
In this sense, the 2023 elections were nothing more than the reunion of the Argentine people with the values of freedom and their rejection of this false god of the state.
En este sentido,
They were not at the national level, and also especially in the province of Chaco.
más que el reencuentro del pueblo
Congratulations, governors of Yayaro. Thank you.
rechazo a este falso Dios del Estado. Lo fueron a nivel nacional y también especialmente en la provincia del Chaco. Felicitaciones, gobernador Esdero. Gracias.
The people could see that beyond their empty promises of happiness, there was only misery and oppression, and that it was always about that.
Pudo ver que detrás de las promesas
Freedom is nothing more or less than the light that allows us to sweep away the darkness
y que siempre se trató de eso.
of those who want to make us slaves.
no es ni más ni
Now,
menos que
the
la
great Jewish-Christian gesture is the permanent liberation
de quienes quieren volvernos esclavos.
of slavery, the eternal success, the reunion with God.
Es la permanente liberación de la esclavitud, el éxito eterno, el reencuentro con Dios.
They take advantage of the lie and fear of the doubt that exists in each of our hearts. But we must not succumb to them. It is enough with a decision, with only one true word, so that all the web of lies they have woven becomes false and disappears. That is why the testimony of each of you is more valuable than 1,000 false headlines. Believe me, because I lived it in my own flesh, to be true and to say it is the true revolution, as well as to find ourselves in the gospel according to John. The truth will dare the free. So, to conclude, capitalism as a system of social cooperation has a natural affinity with Jewish-Christian values, which for so many years the West has been developing in its bosom. Understanding the difference between good and evil and living it is the basis of economic prosperity. Work, savings, and investment naturally arise from men dedicated to living good lives. And institutions only have to accompany this process. It is not necessary to reinvent the wheel. The millennial tradition that gave rise to the West and to our great nation has all the necessary elements to turn us back into a prosperous people. A people capable of preparing themselves with those who lead the path of human progress. There is no more solid foundation on which to build the eternal building of our country than the one that constitutes these values that we are defending and supporting here. It is so that those who provide us with tradition and those who keep it alive are the fire of a past that, when it reaches the hearts of all citizens, illuminates the entire nation through them. We need to meet again with the truths of our past to be able to take a firm step towards our future. A people with this flame in their hearts, a people who have the power to change the world. There comes a universal lighthouse, a light that illuminates the entire humanity with its grace. That is why I tell either Argentina will be the lighthouse of the world, because we are managing to clear the darkness that sheds shadow on the light of faith. In short, and without further ado, I would like to wish God to bless you all. May the forces of heaven be with us. Long life, freedom, courage. Long life, freedom, courage. On life, freedom, courage. Thank you very much. To the President of the nation, Dr. Javier Milei. And we ask the presidents to keep their places, to continue with the activities scheduled at the International Convention on Christian Leadership, Invasion of the Love of God. Thank you very much.